Intel's Arc A750 might give the company a fighting chance, or at least the beginnings of one, in the graphics market. The A770, it just couldn't overcome the driver issues or counterbalance them sufficiently given the price it had. But the A750 is generally within 6 to 8% of an A770, and it's priced at $290 as opposed to $350 for the 16 gigabyte 770. So already the value looks much better against Intel's own higher end card. This isn't new though. We've seen this in the past, like with the RX 470 versus the RX 480 from AMD, for example. And so today we're looking at the 750, which is poised for a better fight at $290. It still has all the same driver issues as the 770, of course, but they might be a little bit easier to look past depending on what type of user you are. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and their Silent Wings 4 fans. The Silent Wings 4 fans market themselves as being useful on radiators, tower coolers, and cases alike. The fans have a 6-pole motor and use a fluid dynamic bearing, which helps with the noise profile and with longevity. The fans use anti-vibration mounts for reduced noise transfer to the case and have a rated lifespan of 300,000 hours. Learn more at the link in the description below. So for the driver discussion and what these cards are, we've already talked about all that. We'll link both of those videos below. But the drivers in the 770 review, it's all the same problems with the 750. We're not going to go over the whole thing again. The biggest problem that Intel has right now is these cards are still lacking some very basic features. And the reason they're lacking features is because even within the same team, Intel is scattered and not really focusing on the right thing. They're focused on stuffing all this bloated bullshit into their drivers rather than trying to get the basics working, like being able to control the fans, for example, or being able to use the user interface without becoming infuriated. But they'll hopefully get there. And we're still excited about the fact that now when we go through GPU benchmarking, we've got 3 different brand names that show up on a chart. The first time we typed in Intel at the front of a video card to go into a GPU benchmark chart was actually a pretty exciting time. So hopefully Intel can pull through, but the drivers, we'll leave the discussion to the past videos, they're still not there. That said, with the right value combination, it might start to make sense for a user who really just wants to buy it almost as like a toy, like something to mess around with, that can hopefully handle the games you play reasonably well. It's useful for things like certain encoding aspects as well. We're not looking at that stuff today, but from a gaming perspective, perhaps in the enthusiast tinkerer market, there's still space for this, even though it doesn't quite fit the mainstream because it would be too frustrating to use and we just can't recommend it there. But getting into this thing, so for the differences, the A750 runs 28xe cores as opposed to the A770, which is at 32. So the 750 is at most of a 770 in terms of what the GPU contains. For shader cores, it's at 4096 on the 770, and it's at 3584 on the 750. Memory has us at 8 gigabytes here, which is plenty for this class of card, and it's a 256-bit bus on both the 770 and the 750. Also, the 750 is still PCIe Gen 4x16, so you've got all your lanes, and it's also a 225-watt TDP, just like the 770. For quick reference, we showed this in the last review as well. We have a price table. We just looked up some cards. We took 3 of the cheapest ones, averaged some really simple stuff. We didn't do anything advanced or special here, and did that before our review so we can kind of frame what competes with what when going into the 750 and 770s. Okay, enough of all of that. This one is genuinely much more interesting from a benchmarking and game standpoint than the 770 because that value is so much stronger. So let's get straight into it and start with some benchmarks. We'll look at thermals, power, the fan behavior, and gaming. Here's the thermal chart for the A770 and the A750 this time, and we're going to repopulate it with the A770 first. With that one, we observed a 72-degree target temperature for the GPU, with the memory running about 80 degrees. Thermals ramped to a steady state temperature at about 250 seconds, so relatively slow due to the rapid fan ramp here. Intel could burn some more time on fan increase in RPM to try and reduce how audible the uptick in speed is, and this comes down to the fan curve that's set in VBIOS alongside the temperature target. Memory thermals ran at about 78 degrees, which is completely reasonable for modern GDDR6 memory packages, so no problems there. The cooler at least appears to be adequate. As for how the fan responds to these conditions, it ramps to about 1600 RPM to hold a target temperature of 70 degrees, just like the A770, except the fan can spin about 100 to 200 RPM slower while holding the same temperature. We already tested noise levels in the A770 review, so you can check that for more detail. It's the same set of fans, so the noise is the same. Power testing is up now. In this one, the Intel Arc A750 pulled 234 watts when under a full load. That has it alongside the RX 6800. So the A750 is far less power efficient here for what you're getting. And it's also about the same as the 3070. Once again, Intel has a ways to go for power efficiency, even on TSMC's node. The RX 6600 is another example of this at 137 watts. The 6600 didn't regularly outperform the A750 in benchmarking, but it did in enough cases to embarrass it at that power difference. We'll start the gaming benchmarks with Total War Warhammer 3 at 1080p with a custom set of high graphics settings, where our standard deviation for average FPS is only 0.3 FPS. This is an extremely precise test in our suite. The Arc A750 tested at 83 FPS average, beaten by the A770 by about 8% at 90 FPS average. So that 7 or so FPS, that is what costs you the extra 50 or 60 bucks, like 20% more expensive to get to the A770. And that makes the A750 look good value-wise, especially considering Intel only sent out the 16 gigabyte 770s, which are more expensive. Moving to comparisons versus NVIDIA, the A750 outperforms the RTX 3050 by 33%, and the 3050 costs 4% more than the 750. It's clear why Intel chose to make comparisons to NVIDIA when boasting about price to performance, because that's where it makes Arc look the best. Forgetting about AMD entirely does Intel some favors here. The 750 performed 14% better than the old RTX 2060, which is actually still available for about $248 new, making the A750 17% more expensive for that 14% gain. The 2060 still somehow remains relevant as even a new purchase in 2022. Compared to the RX 6600 XT at $323, the A750 leads by 3.6%, and it leads the $248 6600 non-XT by 23%. So in this game, the A750 looks good for value. Moving to 1440p, the Intel A750 came up as 57 FPS average, just behind the A770, which scored about 8% higher. The A750 outdid the RTX 3050 by a large 41% margin, clearly establishing itself as a better value than NVIDIA's cheapest RTX card. As for the RX 6600, Intel's A750 runs a 39% higher average FPS, while costing $40 to $50 more. Additionally, the A750 beat the RTX 2060 by 20% and the RX 6600 XT by 16%. The Intel A750 pulls ahead in 1440p proportional to its 1080p rank, and that is due to its advantages in higher resolutions. AMD, as a reminder, has sort of the opposite. It has advantages at 1080p. So that's why these stack up to really widen the gap between these two brands as resolution grows. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, where the Intel Alchemist GPUs sit at the bottom of the chart, even below the old RX 580 and GTX 1070. It's just embarrassing. We confirmed these numbers with Intel, and we also ran the test multiple times. The Arc cards would do better with Vulkan, but suffer with DX11 in some games, and this is one of them. The A750's poor performance here is really brought to light by the RTX 3050, which is 97% ahead in average FPS. The A750 was just leading the 3050 in the last test, so to swing this hard of a loss is impressive, and it speaks to the issues with a new vendor, where it's just not that predictable. The RTX 2060 leads the A750 by 122%, with the 6600 XT leading by a comically wide gap of 186% advantage. So at this point, it's just an Intel Arc problem. The A750 at 120 FPS is led by the A770 by only 5%, but everything else, the gap is much wider than it should be. Here is the Frametime chart. As a reminder, lower is better, but more consistent is best. The problem is apparent at first glance here. From frames 0 to 100, the frame times are between 14 and 16 milliseconds for Intel, and then they immediately drop down to about 8 milliseconds. Slowly, they climb again and then sharply drop again. We see another huge increase in frame times from frame 1950 to 2050, and again near the end of the chart. Now, oddly, these are actually still consistent in the sense that any cluster of frames is pretty close together, and that's good. There are only occasional massive changes, but one of those every now and then when you change scenes or transition in an environment, that's okay. The RX 580, though, gives us the contrast, where it maintains a low frame time line across the entirety of the test. Both cards are fairly consistent in terms of the every few seconds they're clustered close to each other, but the 580 is consistent throughout the entirety of the benchmark. Intel Arc has issues with just certain scenes throughout this test. Even with Intel's 1440p and 4K advantages, it can't overcome the basic problem of just not running DX11 well in this game. The A750 ends up at 99 FPS average at 1440, which sounds fine, except the 580 has the same frame rate and significantly better lows. So for this one, Intel has managed to make something that performs the same as a $200 to $250 card from 2017, which itself is a refresh of a card from 2016. We might as well look at 4K before moving away from this game, but for now we can mark Rainbow Six as functionally broken on Arc. At 4K, the 750 ran at 66.6 FPS average, the number of the beast, except the beast is actually Intel's drivers. The 66.6 FPS result had about the same as the RX 6600, and that amount of sixes is just dangerous for YouTube's auto captioning and might get us demonetized, so we're gonna move on. F1 2022 is one of the easiest graphics loads we test, but it still manages to be GPU bound in most scenarios. It's also running DX12, so we can give Arc a safe haven from the scars left on it by Rainbow Six. The A750 ran at 100 FPS average, leading the $300 RTX 3050 by about 8%. It's not a huge lead, but under normal circumstances, that'd be enough to consider the $290 A750 instead. Unfortunately for Intel, there are wider issues that require a much bigger advantage to overcome the performance inconsistency game to game. For some other options, the RTX 2060 leads the A750 marginally, but not noticeably, and the A770 does about the same, with only a 6 FPS jump. The RX 6600 would be the next major step up. It's about 20 FPS more or so, and the pricing has Arc costing $40 more, so it's looking good for the 66. At 1440p, scaling shifts the A750 ahead of the 2060, now leading by a slight but measurable 6%. The lead over the 3050 grows to 19%, and that's up from 8% at 1080p. It's a big jump. It's starting to become a noticeable advantage for Intel, and those aren't bad here either. It's managing to maintain frame time consistency while also pulling ahead in performance advantage. Let's see how far that scaling will carry the card. At 4K, the A750 now pulls ahead of the RTX 3050 by 32%. So it's gone from 8% to 19% to 32%. That's some wild scaling and not something we've traditionally seen. We know NVIDIA did better towards the 4K side, and AMD did better at 1080p, but we've never seen the differences jump this much from one resolution to the next. Even the A770 broke rank here. It pulled ahead by 17% versus the A750, which is uncharacteristic. This illustrates to us that the hardware differences in the A770 are becoming more relevant to its hierarchical rank, even against a card with the same architecture, when the load is sufficient at 4K. But as for the A750, the card remains mostly playable. You'd just be best off dropping the settings or resolution to get a solid 60 FPS. Final Fantasy XIV is up now, tested using DX11 and running on maximum settings. DX11 is one of the weaker cases for Arc, as we've seen, but it does surprisingly well on Final Fantasy, and that scales rapidly as the resolution increases. The A750 ran at 164 FPS average here, which had it functionally the same as the A770's 173 FPS average. The 770 only has a lead of 5.4%, which, again, isn't worth the 21% price increase. So the A770 almost really doesn't need to exist for this initial launch. It would just be better for Intel's reputation, but they needed multiple products. So compared to the RX 6600, the A750 leads it by about 5%, with a slight reduction in lead from the RTX 3060 while being significantly cheaper. The RX 6600 XT holds an 11% lead here. 1440p gets more interesting, where we previously saw an advantage of about 5% over the RX 6600. The A750 now leads by a massive 28%. Intel's scaling is coming into play. The card jumps ahead of the 6600 XT as well, landing only behind the RTX 3070, the RX 6700 XT, and things above that. As for the A770, that's almost linear in scaling, predictably, because it's the same architecture, and it lands again at about 5% ahead. At 4K, the A750 ran at 52 FPS average, keeping about the same distance between it and the A770 from previous tests. The card is playable, whereas the RX 6600 has dropped into territory where you'd be better off reducing the resolution. The lead of the A750 over the 6600 is now 42%, so it climbed from 5% to 28% to 42%. AMD is trending down, which is known with its architecture. Intel's trending up, and the two of those combine in very interesting ways for the competition between them. If the cards could play at 8K, we might see this continue to ridiculous levels. Shadow of the Tomb Raider brings us back to DX12. At 1080p high, the first thing we noticed was that the A750 had lower 1% and 0.1% lows than we'd expect for the average. But they're not low enough to signal bad frame time spikes or stuttering. It's more of a footnote. The A770 manages to hold a 7% lead over the 750, making the former again seem unworthy, especially considering cards like the 6600 can lead either. The 6600's 126 FPS average result has it 16% ahead of the A750, a stark difference from Final Fantasy, and the 6600 XT holds a 35% lead over the A750. We noticed that the lows recovered in 1440p testing. These results were repeatable between multiple test passes in both resolutions, so to us, this means that the GPU might be shifting its bottleneck more to Intel's strong points, like memory performance. The A750 is about tied with the RX 6600 here, with the measurable lead developing as compared to the RTX 2060 or RTX 3050. Strange Brigade is back. This one isn't played by many people at this point, but it's one of the best optimized games we've tested, and it has Vulkan, which is the real reason we're showing it. This gives a better idea for API scaling. At 1080p, for Intel's weakest situation, the A750 manages 176 FPS average. That has the A770 back to its 8% lead from earlier, and the A750 basically leads everything else, not counting 3070s and up, so it establishes a 23% advantage over the RTX 3060, or a massive 62% advantage over the RX 6600. Finally, for 1440p, the A750 leads the 3060 by 21%, and the RX 6600 is led by 65%. Not much different than before. Intel just needs more games like this. So wrapping up then, first of all, it's been a hell of a 2 weeks here at GN. We're all pretty tired because we had the 4 CPUs, plus we re-benchmarked all the other CPUs because we built new benches and test suites. Then we re-benchmarked all of the GPUs. All this stuff has happened within 2 weeks. It's literally thousands of test passes at this point within 2 weeks from the team here. So first of all, for those of you on my team who do bother to watch the videos after we push them out the door, thank you for getting us through the last few weeks. Now, for the rest of you who are trying to figure out if you want to buy this card, here's the quick recap. The A770, it's about 6 to 8% better than the 750 on average. That difference is functionally meaningless. It's negligible. You're talking about a difference of $60 in actual money. It means a lot more to people than a couple frames most of the time. And that's what we said about the 470, the 480, the 570, the 580, the 590, 580. This is an age-old tale of company launches, 2 GPUs, and one of them is just slightly better than the other one, where it doesn't really make sense to buy the higher-end one. But they're probably just trying to, there's some marketing strategy there with trying to force an upsell in certain segments. So that's the good news, is that it's most of a 770. Now there's also, staying on the upside for a moment here, if you look at games where there's a positive light for Arc, where it's doing well, which again, it's completely chaotic, it's not consistent where it does well and where it doesn't. For the average user, you will not be able to predict where it will do well. We can kind of predict it at this point, but it's mostly down to APIs. So the positive side though, Total Warhammer 3 has the 750 at 1080p at 33% better than the RTX 3050, and the 3050 is a little bit more money, at least at the time we were writing this review. So that's a good thing for the 750. The 750 was also 14% better than an RTX 2060, again at 1080p. Now 1440p, as we've been saying since the A380 review, it starts to do a lot better and really pull ahead as you increase that resolution. And so for 1440, the 750 outdoes the 3050 by 41%. That is a massive increase over even just 1080. And it outdoes the 6600 non-XT by 39%. That's in Total War again at 1440. So that's looking good. And Rainbow Six looks really bad for the 750. So that's sort of the downswing of this. Vulkan has some just general game issues right now. And then and that's not Intel, that's Rainbow Six developers. And then DX11 is just bad for Intel. It's a bloodbath. So in that one, the 2060 outdid the 750 by 120%. So useless in this game with this API for the 750. F1 1080p, it was 8% better than a 3050. Final Fantasy, it was 5% better than a 6600. 6600 XT led it by 11% 1080p in Final Fantasy. So, overall, this one is positioned better. fan could probably use a little more clearance. This was not disassembled, by the way. The card is positioned better than the last one. So purely from performance, if you only look at this in charts and you ignore the entirety of the software experience and the stability and consistency in how the product works, then it starts to look actually defensible as something to purchase. So that's good for Intel. That's where they need to be. They need to be in the camp of like, yeah, I guess I can deal with that for a little bit and hope that they keep pushing driver updates. But for the average user, we still can't recommend Arc right now because it's going to be frustrating for you, and we don't want people to go out there and buy stuff where if you're buying only on charts, it looks doable, and then you're just upset when you get home and it's not working in a way that's easy to troubleshoot. So that's the angle to look at. If you're an enthusiast, that doesn't scare you, great, consider it. A couple things here. So first of all, if you're happy with your computer today, then just general reminder, don't upgrade. If you either upgrade because you feel like you just want a fun project to do, maybe you want something to distract you, whatever, that's great reason to upgrade. But if you're happy with the performance right now and you don't feel like an immediate need to upgrade, go ahead and hang on to what you have, see what rolls out in the next few months. And you stretch your dollar a lot farther that way. It's also just less waste in general, so that's a good thing. We like to remind people of that because it's easy to get so caught up in upgrading cycles. Now, ultimately, remember also, it is not the consumer's responsibility to prop up a $100+ billion company by buying their $300 video cards.
Thanks, Steve.
So if you genuinely need a video card right now and you need something about this performance and you're aware of the downsides and you can deal with them, then at least in terms of pure numbers, it's competitive, but you shouldn't be buying this only because you want to basically fund Intel's Kickstarter. It owns fabs. It is one of the wealthiest companies in the world. In history, it's pretty high up there too. You shouldn't be buying these things purely to support them. It is not your responsibility to pay for Intel's R&D, which is what this is. This is an R&D project, but they had to kick it out there into the wild because otherwise they just can't get enough mass exposure to get all of those bug reports and issues back to iterate fast enough. That's why it had to go this way. So it's up to Intel to earn your money, is what we're saying. And it's not up to you to just buy it just because it's new. And that goes for any of these video card companies. But with what we have today, at least, on the positive side, this one is far stronger than the 770 was at the price point. It is a much stronger value proposition. So they're in a better place than where they were with the 770. The build quality is still really disappointing for the card, and you can watch our teardown on that. And the drivers will keep following up as they iterate and let you know when it gets better and at what speed. But that's it for this one. It's at least a little more positive than the last two videos on Arc, and hopefully Intel can continue this trend because it's getting really interesting, where it's like the best thing that's happened to AMD is Intel entering this market, because now AMD and Intel, a much similar market share than, say, NVIDIA, which is like way out there, they can start competing with each other in ways that should push each other forward. Maybe they can start catching up to NVIDIA. We have other features we want to look at. We want to look at XeSS and RTX or RT and all that stuff. That'll be future pieces. We're too slammed right now. Everyone here is exhausted. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support our unending work on the benchmarking, or patreon.com/gamersnexus if you want to give us a few bucks. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.